Thank you. Awesome. That was the next step. Thank you so much for being here today. It's really a huge pleasure for me to see you all because I haven't seen you for so long and well, not that long, but it feels like a while. I'm really happy to be back here today. I'm especially happy to be back here because Logan is finishing his master's and today is the public defense of that master's. So I, I'm learning to the kinds of things that are important when I'm interacting with potential grad students. And my very first Zoom call with Logan, I remember being struck by just like how enthusiastic he is about everything and what a great naturalist he is. And that definitely, when he came to campus for his interview, he's IDing trees along, the walk across campus. And that sort of excellence in understanding the systems that he works in has been really important for his success in this program and his enthusiasm as well. Like I've rarely met anybody as positive, relentlessly positive about everything, just to the level of just elevating everybody's mood in the lab and my own. And there's never been a time when we've met and I haven't come out of it feeling better than when we started. So over the course of the past couple of years, he's channeled that enthusiasm and that passion for biological systems into a really nice body of science that you're going to hear about today. He's grown immensely in terms of his ability to analyze data, think scientifically, as well as this sort of amazing natural history kind of approach to the natural world, and amazing communication skills, and really to many different kinds of audiences. So, and also just he's really grown in terms of his leadership skills and running crews over the past 2 summers. I think it's lovely to see many of the people who helped collect the data here today. I think they'll all attest to his expertise in that as well. I want to thank everybody who's not in the room, family and friends who are joining us from Zoom. There's somebody monitoring the Zoom if you have an issue. So Natalie is graciously letting people in and can help troubleshoot anything else. But I'm definitely going to miss Logan when he goes. He's going to be heading out to Tennessee. And I hope we get to, this is just the beginning of a long friendship.
Thank you so much, Alice, for that wonderful introduction. And I'd like to echo Alice's thanks to everybody who was able to make it today and everybody on Zoom as well for being able to make it to both of us. All right, without further ado, my thesis has been focused on the drivers of woody avoidance in grasshopper sparrows. And this research is especially important because grasslands and the birds that depend on them are disappearing globally. They're disappearing mostly because of habitat loss, and there's a few different varieties or flavors of habitat loss. You guys might be familiar with agricultural expansion. This figure to my left is showing areas around the world with these darker, more maroon, purpley shades. That's where agricultural expansion is happening more quickly, with those lighter beige colors being where agricultural expansion isn't happening quite as quickly. But it's occurring globally. Another common form of habitat loss that you guys might be familiar with is urbanization, which is when you're converting a grassland into, in this case, a Walmart. And another form that doesn't get as much attention, though, is equally troubling, is woody encroachment, which is when woody plants invade into areas that were historically prairie or grassland. As shown in this satellite image to my left, you have riparian strips with more dense woody vegetation on the peripheries, and areas that were historically more open grassland near the bottom of the image with sporadic shrubs and trees growing within them, demonstrating woody encroachment in our grasslands and prairies. And woody encroachment is occurring globally, as this figure to my left demonstrates. This is a plot showing, or figure showing areas across the southern hemisphere. The areas in blue are where woody plant cover is increasing in savannas. The areas in red are where woody plant cover is decreasing. And the size of that bubble or that dot signifies the percent change annually. And what I want you guys to take away from this figure is that there's more of those blue dots, and those blue dots tend to be quite large. So woody plant encroachment is occurring in grasslands globally, and it's doing it so at an accelerated rate. And there's a number of different grassland birds that are affected by woody plant encroachment, and they're affected both in their abundance and their site occupancy. Some groups of birds include grassland obligate birds, as well as ground nesting species like this eastern meadowlark. And surprisingly, even insectivorous species are even known to decline as a result of woody plants. And they're avoiding woody plants and other tall structures too. Some examples of avoidance of tall structures that aren't necessarily woody plants comes from the grasshopper sparrow, where they're known to avoid power poles in some areas of their wintering range, or Sprague's pipit, where they're known to avoid oil infrastructure in their breeding grounds. Perhaps the most well-known example, the lesser prairie chicken, is known to avoid a variety of woody plants, whether alive or dead, and has even been known to avoid a variety of human or anthropogenic structures like buildings and power lines as well. The ultimate cause of avoidance is largely unknown, but most literature seems to point the finger at predators as playing some sort of role in avoidance behaviors. Predators such as these. There's a number of different predators that can come along with a woody encroachment or woody plant invasion. Avian predators can use woody plant perches as perches to hunt from. And there's been a number of different papers looking at snakes in particular. For example, their abundance and the rate of nest predation in snakes is known to increase as woody plant cover increases in grasslands. And there's been no direct link between small mammalian nest predation and woody plant encroachment, but it is known that many mammals that are known to predate on grassland bird nests increase in activity when woody plant cover increases in the grassland. The mechanism linking woody plant avoidance and predation risk, though, is still largely unknown. And there's a few different ways that there's a few different explanations for why grassland birds might be avoiding woody plants. One is that they're avoiding the predators that come with them. As I've just demonstrated, there's a number of different predators that come along with the woody plant invasion. So these grassland birds might be avoiding areas where woody plant encroachment is occurring because there's just more predators in those areas. This is my current predation risk hypothesis. Grassland birds are avoiding woody plants because of the current predation risk. Alternatively, there's the innate fear hypothesis. Grassland birds, in this case, are avoiding woody plants because they're innately fearful of those plants due to an evolutionary history of elevated predation risk around woody plant areas. So grassland birds' ancestors had to deal with high nest predation rates or high predation rates in areas with woody plants, and the survivors have then passed those genes on. The current grassland birds that we have today are avoiding woody plants as a result, just out of fear of the plants themselves. And a great example of this, again, comes from the lesser prairie chicken. The species is known to avoid tall structures like woody plants and human-made structures for up to 1 kilometer away. These are distances in which these birds are probably not detecting a predator itself, but instead detecting that tall structure and avoiding the tall structure for the object that it is. If we look at a more regional scale, such as the Great Plains, woody plant encroachment is also a huge issue here. As this plot behind me demonstrates, it's showing 4 snapshots from 1990 to 2020. The areas in red are where woody plant encroachment is occurring more quickly. There's more woody plants in the landscape. And the areas in green are where there's less woody plants in the landscape. And then for areas in yellow, that's intermediate between the two. The takeaway from this figure is that between 1990 and 2020, that area in bright red is increasing, particularly in the southeastern Great Plains, but also everywhere. So woody plant cover is increasing on the Great Plains, and it's having negative effects on grasslands and the birds that rely on them just within this region. You look even more regionally at the Flint Hills. The Flint Hills are that region in dark green on the map on the left side of the screen, or I guess your guys' right side. It's that area of dark green in eastern Kansas and northeast Oklahoma. And woody plant encroachment is a big issue in the Flint Hills because this region holds most of the world's remaining tallgrass prairie. So any loss of prairie in this region is a huge hit to tallgrass prairie globally. And current land management practices, at the very least, aren't hindering the spread of woody plants and may even in some cases be promoting the spread of woody plants. Woody avoidance is occurring in grassland birds here in the Flint Hills. We are again familiar with species like the lesser prairie chicken, though not native to the Flint Hills. There's the closely related greater prairie chicken, which is native and known to avoid woody plants. There's also grassland-dependent songbirds like grasshopper sparrows and eastern meadowlarks, which have a well-documented history of avoiding woody plants. This figure on the right, I want you to take a look at the left 2 plots here. In the case of all four plots, actually, those solid lines show trees, and the dashed lines represent shrubs. With these left two plots, it's showing the probability that any of these two species are selecting a site, given the distance that site is from a woody plant or woody vegetation. The takeaway from these two plots is as you move further away from woody vegetation, the probability that any of these two species select that site increases. So they're tending to prefer areas further from woody plants. With the right two plots, it's again showing the probability of any of these two species selecting a site, but in this case, it's whether that site, it's the proportion of woody vegetation at that given site. So as the proportion of woody vegetation at a site increases, the probability that any of these two species select a site decreases as a result too. So we know that grasshopper sparrows avoid woody vegetation, but I want to highlight just how small the change in the percent of woody vegetation is needed in order for grasshopper sparrows to start avoiding an area. In the second bullet point, Silver et al. 2024, this paper found that grasshopper sparrows start avoiding areas with woody vegetation, or start avoiding areas in general if there's more than 3% shrub cover or more than 1% tree cover. So it doesn't take much of a change in the percent of woody plant cover in an area before grasshopper sparrows start avoiding that area. Great. To highlight grasshopper sparrows, they are a common bird, but they're one in steep decline. If you'll take a look at the map on the left side of the screen, grasshopper sparrows are found all across North America. They have a pretty wide breeding distribution. The areas in red are where grasshopper sparrows are breeding. The areas in blue are where they aren't breeding. But what you won't see is that they're breeding all the way from southern Canada to isolated populations in the Andes of Colombia, and they're even breeding in the Caribbean. So they're widespread throughout North America, and still, for the most part, a relatively common grassland bird within that area. What I want to highlight too is that this is even though it's a common bird in steep decline. And since 1970, we've lost 72% of our global population. There's another paper that looked at the time period since 1960 and saw that there's a nearly 80% decrease since 1960. And the same paper from Road to Recovery found that there's a 3.1% annual decline every year since 1970. So this is a bird that isn't doing too well, like many other grassland birds. All right, so I developed an experimental study to compare or to look at my current predation risk and innate fear hypotheses by measuring behavioral and movement responses of breeding male grasshopper sparrows to the deployment of perceived decoy or perceived predators or woody plants on the landscape within their territories. And we did so by tracking their movements and behaviors using an automated radio telemetry system, which I'll talk about shortly. After tagging the bird, we assign them to one of two experimental groups. The first group here is the predator group, but before I get into the specifics of what we did with each experimental group, I'll preface it by saying right after tagging the bird, we had a 2-day acclimation period, where after tagging the bird, we let the sparrow acclimate to having the tag on it so that it could go back to its normal behaviors. And the reason why we selected 2 days is after analyzing birds from 2024, we saw that in general, after 2 days, grasshopper sparrows started behaving normally after that 2-day period. So after that 2-day period, we assigned them to one of two experimental groups. We did so in an alternating manner, with the first bird of the season being assigned to the predator group, the second bird being assigned to the predator tree group, and then alternating each bird depending on its capture date, which group it gets assigned. And I also want to note that in the case of both the predator group and the predator tree group, you'll notice these territory centers. We determined the location of the territory center prior to tagging the bird. We did so by monitoring that bird over a few-day period and trying to figure out where that bird was singing from, where that male grasshopper sparrow was frequenting. And we marked the location with the GPS, and that's where we would determine where we would place the experimental treatments. So in the case of the predator group, we started off with an initial 3-day control period where we monitored the bird's movement under natural conditions. And then we did the same, and then on day 4 through day 6, we deployed a decoy loggerhead strike on the territory of the grasshopper sparrow. We deployed it 20 meters north of the territory center and deployed it on a rebar that we pounded into the ground. It was a decoy loggerhead strike that we bought off Etsy. It was made of felt from a lovely lady from Hungary. And we were able to order it, we were able to customize it so it had all the correct visual colors and proportions that a real loggerhead strike should have. Along with that decoy strike, we deployed a speaker with it that played strike vocalizations, both songs and calls. So in case the grasshopper sparrows didn't visually identify the strike, they could auditorily do so. And Over that 3-day period, we deployed the strike twice a day. Each time we deployed the strike, we did so for a 1-hour interval. We deployed the strike once in the morning before 10, and then once later in the day after 11 a.m. And then each time we deployed the strike with the speaker vocalization loop was set for a 50-minute recording to allow us to escape the area. So we knew the grasshopper sparrows weren't necessarily avoiding us. They were avoiding the strike and its vocalizations, or possibly avoiding the strike and its vocalizations. We use loggerhead shrikes because they're a known predator of grasshopper sparrows. There's been a number of observations of them both eating or caching grasshopper sparrows on barbed wire. And along with that, there's anecdotal evidence of grasshopper sparrows acting fairly agitated to the presence of a live loggerhead shrike in the field, just from observations of Ponza. The other group that we had was the predator tree group. So again, like the predator group, we had an additional 3-day control period to monitor the bird's movements as it normally would behave or move around the landscape. But on day 4, we added 3 2-meter tall cedars that we deployed to fixed locations in the territory. These cedars were deployed 20 meters from the territory center at fixed directions around that territory center. We left those cedars up over that 3-day period. This is what they would look like in the wild. So it may look like they're supposed to be close together, but they do look pretty far apart when you deploy them. And we ended up using eastern red cedar because it is a commonly occurring woody encroaching species here in the Flint Hills. Then for the last 3-day period, we had a predator tree treatment, which is a combination of the predator treatment from the last group I talked about with the trees from the previous treatment. So we left the trees up and then deployed the loggerhead shrike in the same manner that we did with the shrike decoy from the previous treatment. In this case, though, we deployed it on the northernmost cedar. And again, we deployed it twice daily for 1-hour intervals each deployment. And this is what the loggerhead shrike would look like out in the field. The green bag hanging below it is where we had the speaker located. We chose 3 response variables to look at based off of how we expected grasshopper sparrows, or potentially how we expected grasshopper sparrows to respond to these stressors. One way they might respond to a stressor on the landscape is by hiding or making themselves more inconspicuous or obscuring themselves more. And we expected that if we were to look at the home range area of the grasshopper sparrow, if they are showing that behavior, then we should see some sort of change when we analyze the home range under the treatments with the home range during the control period. We measured the home range daily. So every day of the control period, we measured a home range estimate. And for every day during the treatment periods, we also measured a home range estimate, meaning that in the predator group, we had a total of 6 home ranges if they stayed for the entire duration of the treatments. And in the predator tree group, there's a total of 9 if they stayed the entire duration. And we measured the home range in hectares. Another way they might be behaving to these stressors is by distancing themselves or moving further away from the stressor. So we also looked at the distance between each sparrow's location and the territory center. We measured this in meters just to see if there was any movement away to, or potentially even closer, movement closer to the territory center. And lastly, we use the number of location estimates per day. The reason why we chose this response variable is for the same reason why we were looking at the home range area. We expected that if presented with a stressor, the grasshopper sparrows would want to hide, maybe obscure themselves more, meaning that the tag may not be able to, or the receiver that we're using to monitor these birds' signals may not be able to detect as many transmissions if the bird is obscured or maybe behind a hillside or in some dense vegetation. We collected the location estimates from 6 to 10 in the morning, which is the peak time during the day in which male grasshopper sparrows are most active. And we expected that if presented with one of these stressors, we should see a decrease in the number of location estimates. Yeah. All right. For my current predation risk hypothesis, these are the predictions I made for each of my response variables. What you'll note is that the control and tree response variables, or the results from the control and tree treatments, are the same across all response variables, because under the current predation risk hypothesis, we expect that there wouldn't be a change if trees were presented to the grasshopper sparrows, but we do expect a change if predators were deployed on the territory. So in this case, for the home range area, there's no difference between the home range area for the control for the tree treatments, but once presented with a predator, either in the predator only treatment or in the predator tree treatment, we would see the home range decrease, or we'd expect it to. And the reason for this, again, is that we expect the bird to hide more and maybe not make so many long distance movements across the territory, thus causing the home range to decrease in size. For the distance, we expected birds to move further away from the territory center if presented with one of these, with one of the strikes, either in the strike only or the predator plus treatments. But there wouldn't be a change when presented with the treat only. And then for the location estimates, we expected a decrease in the number of location estimates when the strike or when the grasshopper sparrow was presented with either the tree or the predator or the predator plus tree treatments. For the innate fear hypothesis, we should see a change between the control period and any treatment involving a tree. So that could be the tree only or the predator plus tree. In the case of the home range area, we expected a decrease in the home range area between the control and the tree treatments, and the tree treatment should not change when a strike is added, or the home range area should not change when a strike is added to the treatment, in the case of that last bubble there. And then for the distance, we expected the birds to move further away from the tree treatments, because again, we expected the birds to be responding mostly to the trees under this hypothesis. So in this case, when presented with the trees, these grasshopper sparrows, we expected these grasshopper sparrows to be moving further away. And then for my last response variable here, the number of location estimates, we expected the number of location estimates to decrease when grasshopper sparrows were presented with the trees. We conducted this study, this experimental study at 2 different study sites in the Flint Hills. In 2024, we worked at Conza Prairie Biological Station, as shown on the top there. And then in 2025, we moved to Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve. We ended up moving sites between years because of the background level of woody encroachment at Conza. As you can see in this image behind me, there's a lot of woody encroachment occurring in the riparian strip on the top left of the Conza image on the left side of the screen. And this is maybe not a very fair comparison of the photos because there's not much woody encroachment or many woody plants that typically are on the plateaus, either at Conza or Tallgrass. But trust me, in that Tallgrass Prairie image, if you were to look in the riparian strips on either side of that plateau, there might have been a handful of woody plants, but within the study area that we were working in, I could probably count the number of woody plants on 2 hands. Really wasn't much. And we found it difficult if we were to continue working at Conza with disentangling any responses that we'd expect from the manipulated woody plant cover that we were deploying on the territories from that background level that is already existing at Conza. At Conza, we worked in a number of different watersheds or pastures. These were all dominated by tallgrass prairie and burned on a 1 to 3 year burn interval. We worked predominantly in cattle grazed pastures, but in some ungrazed pastures as well. And these pastures were grazed throughout the growing season from typically March or April through October. And then at Tallgrass, we worked in 2 different pastures that were, again, tallgrass dominated. These were burned every 2 years and were, in the case of the tallgrass pastures, they were grazed by cattle, both of them. We worked from mid-May through the end of July during both field seasons to cover the peak of the grasshopper sparrow breeding season. We used a number of different tags across both years. In 2024, we used this tag exclusively. It's a life tag developed by CTT, very lightweight. It has a solar panel, but it has no battery, meaning that it can only emit signals if it's in good lighting. So it can emit signals during the day, but it wouldn't be able to emit signals at night or potentially even during a really intense storm. We weren't able to deploy all of our life tags in the first season. So when we moved to Tallgrass, we ended up deploying the rest of the life tags that we had from the previous season, alongside a number of power tags, which are the same weight as the life tag. The main difference between the two being that, again, the life tag is solar powered, and the power tag in this case is battery powered, meaning the power tag is a definite lifespan, whereas the life tag could theoretically work, indefinitely. It also meant that the power tag wouldn't be able to transmit signals for over 3 months. We had a program to emit signals for at least 3 months. So birds tagged with power tags at the beginning of the season, we would be able to get movement data on those birds all the way to the end of the season. And for birds tagged at the end of the season with power tags, we could maybe get post-breeding movements even though it's not related to this project. And then lastly, we use the hybrid tag, which you can think of as kind of a combination of the previous 2 tags. It has both a battery and a solar panel to recharge it. It's a little bit heavier than the other 2 tags. We can only deploy it on the heaviest birds that we came across, but this was the optimal tag to use because of that, the ability for it to still emit signals at night, just like the life tag. The image in the bottom left is showing what a tag would look like on a grasshopper sparrow. This is a grasshopper sparrow that we tagged at Kanza in 2024. And you can see that there's a solar panel hanging out just in between the wings on the back. These tags would kind of fit on the birds a little bit like a backpack with leg loops wrapped around the legs, and the tag fitting snugly to the lower back of the bird. With the life tags, they had the solar panel positioned right in between the wings so they could get solar energy. The same thing goes for the hybrid tag, which also had the solar panel. And you can see that there's a little antenna, quite a long antenna sticking out behind the bird. Often we use this to resight our birds if we couldn't see color bands or bands on the birds from a distance, you could actually still see the antenna often hanging out behind the bird. And then we ended up using these 3 different tag types because number one, they're compatible with the receivers that we used, and they're also compatible with a wider continental radio tracking system known as MODIS. So again, if the birds were to wander outside of the study sites that we were working at, we might still be able to track them if they're to make long distance movements, either during the breeding season or during migration. This is what the receivers we used look like. They're known as nodes, also developed by CTT, and they have a number of unique characteristics, such as this omnidirectional antenna. This antenna can detect signals from the tags that we were using, of course, but it can detect signals from any direction around it. There's no directionality of the antenna. It also came equipped with a solar panel to keep recharged, and whenever it detected a transmission from one of our tags, it stored that on an SD card that we could access from the bottom of that receiver. We deployed the receivers on 2-meter tall poles. This is because in order for one of the tags or one of the receivers to detect a tag, it for the most part needs to be line of sight to the tag in order to detect it. So we elevated the receivers on 2-meter tall poles in order to cover a wider area around the receiver so that we could decrease the chance that a sparrow would hide from us within the study area. These 2 plots are showing the distribution of nodes at either site with Kanza on the left and tallgrass on the right. What you'll note is that, number one, there's a pretty large difference between the number of receivers that we used at both sites, but also in the distribution of those receivers. While we were at Kanza, we worked predominantly in these northern watersheds at the beginning of the season because these southern watersheds were mostly burned. And again, like I had said earlier, the areas where grasshopper sparrows were breeding at Kanza were a little bit more patchily distributed. So we had to deploy the nodes in isolated locations in order to cover areas where most of the grasshopper sparrows were. As the season progressed, grasshopper sparrows were being found more in the southern areas, which is why we ended up having to move receivers throughout the season to cover areas where the grasshopper sparrows were showing up, which meant that every 2 to 4 weeks, the receiver had to get moved to a different location, which was a whole hassle. And then at Tallgrass, we had a total of 70 nodes. We ended up having a ton donated to us by Professor Andy George from Pittsburgh State. Thank you, Andy. We ended up having about 70 to 80 receivers donated to us between the 2024 and 2025 seasons, which is why we have so many deployed at Tallgrass. And what was really great about Tallgrass too is once we deployed a receiver at Tallgrass, we didn't have to take it down until the end of the season. That was unless something horrible happened to that receiver. We had a couple instances where cows trampled receivers, and one instance where one fell off the top of one of the poles and hit me in the head and it split apart. That was, I think, only 3 receivers over the course of the season, so that's pretty good. We tracked these birds using arrays of receivers as I've demonstrated. That said, the receivers don't just give you the location of the bird. There's a lot of data processing in order to get there. What they do record, though, is once a signal from a tag reaches a receiver, the receiver records the tag's unique identification. It records the date and timestamp of that received signal, and then it records the signal strength as denoted by RSSI, the residual signal strength indicator. This RSSI value will become really important on this next slide. The first step in order to determine the location of a sparrow is by determining the distance that sparrow, or at least the tag, is from each of the receivers. We did so using this is an example of the exponential decay function that I had to create. What it does is it allows me to look at one of these receivers, for instance, receiver 1, identify the signal strength recorded with a certain transmission, and then plot that on the curve to figure out how far away the tag or sparrow was from that receiver. On the right-hand side of the screen, this is denoted by that dark blue or navy blue circle around the receiver. Creates that perimeter, that circumference there. And we can do the same thing for each of the other receivers within that array. So all 4 of these receivers get plotted with distance values associated with them. The next step is to use trilateration, which is a step that takes those distance estimates and creates location estimates using them. The way it does that is by looking at those dark or navy blue circles around each of the receivers and finding that location of common intersect between all the circumferences, or maybe the area of common overlap. It then needs to uses three receivers that have all picked up the same transmission in order to create one location estimate. So there's a lot of data processing even just to get one location estimate, and we had thousands that we created over the 2 summers. So this is what it would look like. It would predict that area with some error around where the circumferences would overlap or intersect. We then were able to use that location data for our response variables, such as the home range analysis. We analyze the home range using autocorrelated kernel density estimates. This is what an AKDE would look like on the right there, with those red dots signifying locations of sparrows, or in this case, some random animal. Those areas in blue signifying the likelihood of encountering one of that animal's locations or the animal itself, with the darker blues representing areas where you're more likely to encounter locations or the animal. And then the black circles or gray lines around that area are the 95% confidence intervals. The reason why we used AKDEs is even though they produce larger home range estimates than more traditional methods, these home range estimates tend to be more accurate than, say, your standard kernel density estimate. On to the results. In total, we tagged a total of 76 sparrows across both seasons. When we look at the breakup among the different treatment groups, we had 17 total birds, or 17 replicates in the predator group, 8 coming from Kanza, 9 from tallgrass. And then, funny enough, we also had 17 from in the predator group, with 9 coming from Kanza and 8 coming from tallgrass. You might notice that there's quite a bit of a discrepancy between the total number of birds tagged and the total number of treatments we were able to deploy, 76 versus 34. So what happened to all those birds in the meantime? Well, maybe dispersal, breeding dispersal. I'll show that on the next slide. But what ended up happening is after we tagged a bird, there's often times when the bird would just disappear. And initially, we didn't know where they were going, whether the bird maybe died or the tag dropped off. We had a hunch that maybe they were dispersing to other areas beyond the study site. And we were able to document this. Well, I'll show that in a little bit, but here, what we do know about breeding dispersal on grasshopper sparrows is that, at least at Kanza, 75% of males are known to disperse from one site to another site within the same breeding season. So they'll move sites often pretty far distances and breeding multiple times throughout the season. And they're known to disperse up to and exceeding 9 kilometers away from their initial territory. Well, we were able to document this from birds this past summer. This is one of our birds that we nicknamed Yogi. We tagged him on June 2nd at Tallgrass, which is close to that lower green circle right here. And we ended up detecting him on that tower on June 4th. He flew south and then hooked north and was detected at 4 different towers in the same night. Tallgrass, this tower down here, and then made it all the way up to the western side of Fort Riley, all in the same night. And then 2 days later, he was picked up again at Fort Riley, but flew right by Kanza, this green circle right here, to Skyline Preserve on that night. Another fun bird was Ricky Bobby. We tagged him shortly before June 17th. He was detected by the Tallgrass Tower on June 17th, and again by the Harrington Tower, which is the green dot just northeast of the Tallgrass Tower, that same night. And then 4 days later, he was detected by a tower south of Kearney, Nebraska, for a total of a 326-kilometer journey, which is pretty far. This same week, too, we had 2 other birds that made the same flight, getting picked up by the same 3 towers in that order. And what was really interesting that we were able to find from these detections is that these detections were occurring at night. There's been no documentation of, there's been no record of when grasshopper sparrows disperse. This is the first time we've ever found out that they actually are doing these movements at night instead of during the day, which is really interesting. It's just, this is another example of a bird. I wanted to include this bird because we were able to get post-breeding movements on these birds. In this case, Sag Paneer, which I think we named because we were maybe hungry that day. We talked about Indian food a lot out in the field. He was detected by the Tallgrass Tower on October 18th, made it all the way down at least to Tallgrass Prairie Preserve in Oklahoma that same night. And then 3 weeks later, ended up in Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in coastal Texas for a total distance of 1,200 meters. And that's a total distance of, that's a straight line distance. It's not maybe any circuitous routes that the bird took in that flight. So just to recap from those cool results from the dispersal and migratory data, none of our birds at Kanza showed or were detected on this wider MODIS tracking network, but we had 13 birds from tallgrass that were. And as I'd mentioned, the birds were dispersing at night. The tags that we were using at Kanza were life tags. They couldn't emit signals at night. So it would make sense, given now that we know that birds these sparrows are dispersing at night, why we didn't see any detections during 2024. And we know too now that they're dispersing as far as 326 kilometers, which blows previous estimates out of the water. All right, now on to some of the main results. And I want to preface this slide and the next coming slides by saying that the analysis that we used in all of our response variables were linear mixed effect models, treating individual sparrows as a random effect and site as a fixed effect. With the plots on the right, these are model estimated means with standard error bars on either side. These are the results from looking at the differences between home ranges between Kanza and tallgrass. And really interesting that birds at tallgrass had a larger home range than birds at Kanza. In fact, they're about 7.1 hectares larger. So quite a bit of a difference, given these birds were known to only have home ranges of about 1 to 2 hectares in size. So quite a bit of a difference between these two groups, between the two sites. And when we look at the predator tree group, we see a similar pattern occurring. In this case, tallgrass birds had home ranges that were as large as 8.2 hectares, or larger than Kanza birds by 8.2 hectares. So again, quite large in size as both this estimate says, and then also the figure on the right. Looking at the differences between treatments, just to explain why the home ranges were larger from birds at tallgrass compared to birds at Kanza. Well, we have a couple different possible explanations for this. One being just differences between the sites. As I've mentioned, there's more woody plants at Kanza, so they might have been more restricted in the area that they could use, causing there to be lower or smaller home ranges than the birds at tallgrass. Another explanation that I think holds a lot of water is the number of receivers that we had at either site. Like I had mentioned, we only had 22 receivers that we deployed at Kanza, but we had 70 that we were able to deploy at tallgrass, meaning if a sparrow was to move 100 or 200 meters away from its initial territory, then we would have a better chance of still picking up that bird using our receivers at tallgrass rather than Kanza. All right, now on to the main results. Looking at the predator treatment, the home range results for the predator treatment, we found no difference in the home range size between birds during the predator treatment and their control. These results were not consistent with either hypothesis. And just as a reminder, if the results were consistent with the current predation risk hypothesis, then we should have seen a significant decrease in the home range size during the predator treatment compared to the control. With the predator tree treatment, again, we saw no difference between the predator tree group. We saw no difference between the tree treatment and the predator tree treatments with their controls. This again didn't support either hypothesis. If we expected, or if these results were to support the current predation risk hypothesis, then we should have seen a significant decrease in the home range size during that last treatment on the far right. If the innate fear hypothesis was to be supported, then both the tree only in the middle there and the far right predator plus tree treatments should have been significantly smaller than the control. We didn't see that here. Now on to my distance data. We had a total of nearly 29,000 distance calculations across both seasons. When you break it up by group, in the predator group, we had nearly 13,000 distance calculations. And in the predator tree group, we had just over 16,000. Comparing the predator treatment to the control, birds actually moved closer to the territory center when the decoy predator was deployed on the territory. This was a really interesting result And it goes against the current predation. It does not support the current predation risk hypothesis, which, as I'll remind you, we expected there to be an increase in the distance during the predator treatment compared to the control. They actually moved closer when we deployed the decoy strike. With the predator treat group, the tree treatment, our birds during the tree treatment, again, they moved closer to the territory center when presented with the trees, which is, again, an interesting result, because if these results were to support the innate fear hypothesis, we would expect them to move further during the tree treatment, not closer, like this shows. And then during the predator tree treatment, birds moved further away from the territory center, which would support the current predation risk hypothesis if the result from the predator group had also been that too. What I will note though is that, as you'll see with these estimates, birds were only moving 4, 5, and in the predator group, 11 meters closer or further away from the territory center. And with birds that are having home ranges as large as what we were documenting, we expected apologies. We expected, my bad, thank you. I'll actually move on to the number of location estimates here. I'll try to recall what I was trying to say there. For the results from the number of location estimates in the predator group, we saw no difference in the predator treatment when you compared it to the control, which did not support either hypothesis, because we expected the predator treatment to have fewer location estimates than the control in this case. And then during the predator tree treatment, interestingly, we saw fewer locations when sparrows were presented with the tree-only treatment, and we again saw fewer locations when the predator tree treatment was deployed on the territory, which directly supports the innate fear hypothesis, which, as you'll recall, predicted that the number of location estimates would drop when trees were presented on the territory, whether in the tree-only treatment, or during the predator tree. Just for a review of all of the results so far and my predictions given either hypothesis. For the daily home range area, if the results were consistent with the current predation risk hypothesis, then we should have seen a decrease in the home range area during predator treatments. For the innate fear hypothesis, we expected there to be a decrease in the home range area when presented with tree treatments, whether the tree or predator plus tree treatments. We didn't see any change in the home range areas and the results of the daily home range area under either hypothesis or with these two analyses, meaning the results of neither analysis was able to support either hypothesis. In the distance to territory center, we expected birds to move further away from the territory center when presented with a predator treatment if the results were consistent with the current predation risk hypothesis. If results were consistent with the innate fear hypothesis, we expected birds to move further away when presented with a tree. Well, we got a little bit of mixed results when presented with either the tree only or the predator only. There was no result that supported the hypothesis. However, when presented with the tree plus strike, they did move further away, which supports kind of both, but mostly I would say the innate fear hypothesis, which I'll get to at the end of the slide, why I'm thinking. With the number of location estimates, if the current predation risk hypothesis is to be supported, then we expected there to be fewer location estimates during the predator treatments. If the innate fear hypothesis is to be supported, then we expected fewer during the tree treatments. Well, what we ended up seeing was that during the predator-only treatment, birds, there was no change in the number of location estimates. When presented with a tree-only treatment, there was a change. There's a decrease in the number of location estimates. And when presented with a combination of the two treatments, there are also fewer treatments, meaning that the innate fear hypothesis on the far side ended up having more support for it overall, given that there were fewer locations both during the tree and the combination of the predator plus tree treatments. So what do we know? We know that grasshopper sparrows are fearful of woody plants. We've known this from before the study, and the support does support that. And it supports that because there were fewer location estimates made during the tree treatments, suggesting that there is some hiding behavior going on. But it appears that birds aren't necessarily changing their space use in response to their space use, such as their home range area or their distance away from the territory center. So birds are hiding, but it wasn't being picked up by the home range area analysis. So innate fear is potentially a mechanism, or is possibly a mechanism for woody avoidance. And woody avoidance appears to be occurring in the absence of predators. This means that controlling predator populations is likely not an effective management strategy to mitigate avoidance. It explains avoidance in a variety of tall structures, such as woody plants or other anthropogenic structures. And they're very easy to implement solutions. So we got to experience over the last couple of years. It could be a really fun lab activity to go out and cut down cedars. We got to do so at Kanza, and that's private property near Tallgrass. And it could be a pretty de-stressing activity if you're not getting poached too much by the cedars. So innate fear is potentially an explanation for woody avoidance that's occurring in grassland birds across the planet. And it really highlights the need to take action to mitigate these grassland bird declines. With that, I'd like to acknowledge, first off, my advisor, Dr. Alice Boyle, for all of her commitment, her guidance throughout the past few years. It's been really fun to be a student under you. I'd also like to acknowledge my committee, my technicians, who I'm glad most of them were able to show up today, my family, including Tiffany Huff, my parents, grandparents, and my sisters, Jordan and Riley. I'd like to highlight all of my friends that have either made here or before my master's. They're all listed right there on the right side. Thank you all. I'd also like to acknowledge my funding sources. Thank you to all my funding sources, and thank you to the staff from Tallgrass and from Kanza who were able to support me on this mission. In this project. Thank you again to Dr. Andy George from Pittsburgh State for donating all those nodes. And I totally forgot to acknowledge John Flavin, who actually flew a plane over both Kanza and Tallgrass with our antennas to try to find birds that we had lost. So thank you, John. With that, I'd like to open up to any questions. Thank you.
Do you think that the birds could have perceived the nodes as like a tall structure to be afraid of?
That's a great question. I don't think they were perceiving the nodes as tall structures, only because on occasion we would observe grasshopper sparrows singing from them. In many of the territories that we were tracking were birds that we commonly observed singing within 20 to 30 meters of the receivers.
To follow up on that, I was wondering if there were any like birds of prey perching on them, or did you?
No,
did you
we
see
never
any
detected
other?
a bird of prey perching on them. In fact, while we were at Kanza, there's only one or two times where we ever saw even a predatory bird in the area, and those were loggerhead shrikes. And then at Tallgrass, we also observed loggerhead shrikes on a couple of occasions in the areas we were surveying grasshopper sparrows, but never on the nodes. Yeah.
Also, can you repeat questions so people on Zoom can hear better?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Do you know the range, like how big a grassland needs to be intact for a grasshopper sparrow to be there?
That's a great question. So for those on Zoom, the question was how large an area is needed in order for grasshopper sparrows to be there? And it depends on the region, it seems. With areas further east, the areas, if I can recall, don't need to be as big. Whereas areas out here in the Midwest and even further west, they're typically found in larger tracts. Yeah, but it varies depending on the study. Yeah.
Seems like Tallgrass Prairie Preserve and Kanza are pretty different.
Mhm.
I mean, do you think your results might have been influenced by just differences between the sites, combining all this data?
With the whole range area data, certainly. We included site as a fixed effect in all of our analyses, and we weren't able to detect any differences between sites and any of our other response variables. So I don't think they played a large role outside of maybe just the home range area. Yeah.
This might be a dumb question, so it's okay to tell me this.
No.
But given how many grassland sparrows have already been lost, and you're already kind of working with like a smaller portion of what the once large population size was, you think there's a chance that the phenotype of birds that are left are just the less wimpy ones? Like maybe the more wimpy phenotype of grassland sparrows has been lost over the last 20 years. You're doing an experiment on fear on the ones that are the least responsive to a fear response, because they're just the hardiest version of grassland sparrow phenotype that might be left up against.
I think the population size is still large enough to maybe mitigate any of that. I didn't mention it, but I think the estimate as of 2015 or 2022 is 32 million grasshopper sparrows, and we're at the core of their range. So I would expect their genetic diversity to be better in this region. I would wonder that question about birds out east that were captive habitat are more widely distributed.
So I recognize that if you're going to look at grassland species on a global scale, there's probably a lot more nuance and variation. But if you're just looking at a North American scope, to what degree do you think this approach to studying grassland species could be replicated from species to species, say to casting sparrow or bark bunting or Sprague's pipit or anything like this? Could you do something in a rather similar manner?
I forgot to repeat the last question, but this question is whether I could repeat the same study with another grassland species. And I don't see why not. Yeah, with the case of Sprague's pipits, what I do know about their habitat is there's not many woody plants. So maybe with grassland birds who are accustomed to woody plants like Sprague's pipit, there might be more of a response to the trees being placed on the territories, whereas grasshopper sparrows, like the ones that breed here and further east, are maybe more accustomed to trees. So I maybe worry a little bit about that, whether the species is like the propensity of woody avoidance in a species, but I think you could probably repeat. I'm sure you can repeat stuff with other species.
So you said there were cattle present in both places. I was curious about sort of large grazers and the presence of birds. Has anybody ever looked at whether, like the lack of grazers would increase their population or decrease? Is there a relationship there?
There is a relationship with, the question was, would I expect a difference if I was working in pastures that were ungrazed, mostly, right?
Yeah.
And grazed. And there is a difference. Grasshopper sparrows prefer some local site heterogeneity, areas that are more dense with vegetation and grasses where they can nest, in areas that are more bare where they can forage. And those areas that are more bare typically are created by cattle grazing. So they tend to benefit from low intensity grazing, maybe moderate intensity grazing, but maybe not so much from high intensity. I think there is a spectrum, but there might be differences. I just don't know how many sparrows you'd find in ungrazed areas.
So you chose those sites because there are more birds?
There are more birds. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
First of all, really nicely done. So
thank you so much.
thank you. Thanks for the broad introduction. I had a question with your experimental setup.
Yeah.
You said the activity of sparrows is between 6 and 10 a.m.
Yeah, the peak of their activity.
And then you put the predators out, you said at 10?
Before 10 in the morning.
Okay.
So, but that would typically occur between sunrise and 10. So about 6 in the morning, maybe a little bit later or earlier, depending on the time of the season.
Okay, so it overlapped with the peak of activity.
Yes, yeah. And there would be another deployment later in the day after that peak too. Yeah.
Have you tested whether if you put them out before they actually start being active, whether that would change things?
No, we didn't test that. I'm not sure if it would. Like before, you're talking about like before 6 a.m. maybe.
Yeah.
Well, at that point it'd be dark, so I'm not sure if they would be able to detect the strike as easily. That's a good
But
question.
once they start, right? So I wonder how much, I mean, if you step in there and set them up, and I'm hoping there's a tolerance. I was just curious of where you chose that setup.
Yeah, we chose it mainly to cover that first part of the morning, to cover the heightened activity. And then later in the day, we initially were tossing around whether to do it all day, but we thought that would be inducing too much stress into the birds we were monitoring. So that's why we ended up with the design of twice daily for an hour each piece. But we wanted one of those to cover the height of their activity each day.
Logan, I thought you did really great. I guess my question's more about like next steps of this. So you kind of showed that like initially this pulse disturbance, right, is affecting them, or at least some presence of that. For next steps, would you think about like, where would you wanna go? Would you wanna look at density, like if you added a bunch of big trees and see the bird decline, or like, where would you wanna see this work go next?
That's a good question. So the question was, where would I want to see this work go next? This harkened back to somebody else's question, but I would be curious to know how grassland birds who are already dealing with varying levels of woody encroachment, like grasshopper sparrows out east are probably dealing with woody plants more than birds out here. And if you go further west, they might even be encountering less woody plants. Be interesting to see if there's any difference between how grasshopper sparrows or maybe another grassland species is dealing with variation in woody plant cover across the range. I think that'd be a cool avenue. But we also talked about looking at the home range area. And it was, especially noteworthy that the home ranges at tall grass were so much larger. And there could be a number of different reasons for that, but that would be a cool avenue of research to pursue.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Logan, going off that, there are a couple questions online.
Yeah.
First is kind of related from Tiffany. Is it possible that if a larger bird of prey was used, that there would be more noticeable movement?
So the question was, if I used an alternate predatory bird that was larger, would there be any like difference in the movement or expected movement of the birds? I don't know. When working at either site, loggerhead shrikes were the only predatory bird that we would encounter other than maybe a flyover red-tailed hawk. And I never saw grasshopper sparrows react to red-tailed hawks. So I don't know if there would be other predatory species that would have that effect. But I think the loggerhead shrike was a good choice simply because of the auditory component of the decoy as well. But I would like to know how they react to snakes, given some of the snake literature I talked about.
That sounds awesome. And then the second one was, what were your biggest lessons learned about using MODIS in this type of system and bird species? Put another way, what advice would you give folks looking to apply similar MODIS tech in other open systems?
So the question was, what are the positives and negatives of using MODIS in the system? In an open prairie system? Well, in my case, with using the receivers that we use, they're solar powered. So the big positive was that with an open landscape that gets a lot of sun, those receivers could keep charged, which is a big concern when using them in forested environments. I don't see how there would be like what the drawbacks would be about the wider kind of tower system that was able to document those longer distance movements. I don't know if there would be a drawback or positive depending on the habitat or region. Yep. Sweet.
All right, thank you for coming.